This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, let's begin. We're going to talk today. We're going to have two perspectives on this notion of planning outside the West. Necessarily, this is. I mean, I feel like I say this every time, but this is a topic that could be a whole subject in itself, if not a whole kind of career of study. So, necessarily, we not only have to just leap to little case studies and generalizations, but we also have to be really brief within those things. I'm going to try, and I know you know me well enough already to know that I say this all the time. I'm going to try and keep this down to a relatively manageable amount of time, but I also have that. I think it's a great excuse that I'm really, really interested. I'm really interested in this stuff, and I want to convey how interesting it is to you. But nevertheless, I think I should try and be as short and concise, and I'm in the way that I am not being short or concise right now by rambling before I've even started. Okay. So if you ever take a job like this, bear in mind, don't stand in front of the audience for 10 or 15 minutes just talking about how you're trying to keep it short. I want to briefly talk to you, emphasis on the word briefly, about 20th century, largely 20th century planning in the two biggest and most important. Sorry if you're from another communist nation or formerly communist nation, but the two biggest, most important nations under communism. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some of the things that were done in Soviet Russia, which you are probably aware is no longer a communist nation, just an appallingly corrupt and tyrannical one, and China as well, which is ostensibly still a communist nation, although it's a particular variety of communism that would have been regarded with some suspicion even 30 years ago, even in China, let alone in the kind of heyday of communism. This is an image of modern Moscow in the 1920s, so almost 100 years ago. And it resonates with a whole lot of elements of the brave new 20th century. And a Muscovite or a Russian, possibly even a European generally, who saw this image would be taken aback by what it conveys. It's a rather beautiful painting, in my opinion. It shows the streets awash. It's rained recently, but possibly that it has some kind of metaphorical resonance in terms of clean, start again, clean and fresh. The streets are full of cars, which are of course a symbol of not only modernity but also of prosperity, wealth, efficiency, modernism generally. People are out socialising. There are some skyscrapers there. I think we'd call those skyscrapers. There's some high-rise buildings in any case, probably new. There's technology like telephone poles, telegraph poles, or maybe they're electricity poles, I'm not sure, but whatever they are, they're conveying something around the city. And the messages, which are many, all, I think, boil down to, oh sorry, I also forgot, woman driving a car. That's another aspect. There's an aspect there of equality as well, between the, gender equality as well. Probably young woman driving a car. So the messages are many, but there's one particular message, which is, you've come a long way, USSR, in a very, very short time. That things have really happened super fast, and things are going well in communist Soviet Russia. The USSR, and this image of a metropolis in Moscow, the capital of the USSR, is also saying that planning in the USSR, planning under communism, unleashes possibilities that could only have been dreamt of earlier. I'm going to touch on some of those possibilities. First of all, I just quickly want to mention, and this will resonate with when I start talking about China. I can't remember if I've discussed Dairen, also known as Dalny.
Excuse me, teacher. I just want to wonder whether this city is actually changed its name.
It has.
It's our hometown.
It has changed its name, yes.
It's called Dalian.
Dalian, that's right. Right, which I've got there as the third option.
Northeastern of China.
It's not, sorry?
It might be northeastern of
Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Well, then if I made a typo then, I'm sorry about that. But this is the place that Russia established. I believe the Russians leased the land, built a city in this part of China that was basically a trading port, and one of the things that this was used quite often in the late 19th, early 20th century as an example of a planned town from the outset, and it was, as you can see, divided into European town for the Europeans that lived and worked there, and the Chinese town for the Chinese people who were either in the area already or who were brought in to work there. A fairly classic plan form from the outset, and distinct zoning on ethnic lines. Is that really planning outside the West? Actually, it's not, I'd say. I mean, Russia at that time was, pre-communist Russia was essentially a Western, in a manner of speaking, certainly a capitalist in a manner of speaking, country. So it's more like a colony than anything else. But I felt like it had to be talked about. And we have some other examples as well of European trading zones in China in the period before the First World War, over 100 years ago. Is maybe it's a minor point. So it's colonialism that leading to urban development. That's the main point. In Russia, we have a nation that is extremely diverse, as we know, spans from Europe all across to Asia, covers both of those continents, large parts of both of those continents. You probably already know that I have a terribly dangerous theory that Europe is just part of the Asian continent, really, and we only call it a continent because we're so beholden to the notion of European culture, but let's not, I don't need to waste your time on that right now. The point is that Russia was a severely delayed developmentally nation even in the 19th century. It was very slow to grow. It was quite a backward outpost in lots of ways. A great example is St. Petersburg, where there were attempts to build the top diagram there is the conception of what would happen. Of course, this is the 18th century, not the 19th, but the top is a conception of how the city should grow, and the bottom is how it looked at that time, pretty depressing. In places like St Petersburg, there were apartments for the wealthy built at the city centre. No legal entitlement on anyone to fix poor housing. Sanitation was only a fact of the very central parts of the cities. In 1911, there were 1,063 towns in Russia with a population over 10,000. And only 1/5 of those towns had a water supply at all. Urban Russia had a high death rate, had no zoning, and it had no planning. So, around a little over 100 years ago, I believe, around 100 years ago, we have the Russian Revolution. In the main, individual land ownership was no longer possible. And from the point of view of those who wish to improve cities, this meant that there could now be a reasoned and fair approach taken to the reordering of urban forms and services. A really good example of that is the Moscow Underground Rail Line, which many felt was completely impossible up till this point. We'll talk about that in a little while. There was much more housing now available to workers. Many of those workers were placed in what had been the dwellings of the wealthy, which they often had to share with other people and other families. No exploitation of renters under the new regime. House rent was fixed by law according to square metres and adjusted according to the earning power of individuals. Rent could be no more than 1/10 of a family's income, and that increased a little bit, but basically stayed the same for 50 years. As well as the housing, fixing the housing crisis by sharing housing, residential areas amongst the greater populace. We also have the creation of workers' clubs, which are a major new element in the major cities of the USSR. And these, kind of mirror, as they did in Western countries, they kind of mirror the notion of the gentleman's club. They're often set up in former private houses or churches or sheds. In 1921, they established the State Planning Commission. The State Electrification Commission is also created, and from that comes the first planned settlements across the USSR. The first public dwelling houses are created using plans of 3 to 4 living rooms per dwelling. Large apartments might include between 2 and 4 families. Here's a workers' club, much later in the proceedings in the 1960s, I think. I'm going to be using quite a few illustrations from an American cartoonist called Jay Darling, who calls himself Ding, and Ding went to Russia, published a book in the early 1930s using, first-hand sketches from that time, very antithetical to communism and to the Russians in many ways. So take everything, I guess, with a grain of salt. Who really knows? But the images are quite delightful. Living combines are created. So there's particularly in the 1920s, very early in Soviet Russia, there is an experiment that goes on about the idea of a living cell. This is, it's almost, imagine it a bit like a big hotel in a way, that you live in permanently, in the sense that, for instance, one communal house might have 300 single rooms. For couples or for bachelors, which I guess means no children in many instances, with 9 to 12 square metres of dwelling space per person, with some housekeeping provided, so that's thrown in. Someone will come and clean your living cell. All the rooms will be accessible from middle corridors with common toilets and washrooms and bathrooms and cooking spaces. So there's that, in that sense, it's a bit like a hotel and a bit not. But it's certainly a way to rationalise not only living conditions, but arguably also a way to rationalise society. In a lot of these buildings, you'd find a kindergarten, perhaps you might find a club, a library, a restaurant, all centrally located. And some say it was intended as an ideological tool to disrupt the family. And there is a strong feeling in this period that, that perhaps the best way forward was to kill off those intrinsic, inherited notions of social obligation, not just to one's parents and background necessarily, perhaps also to one's family. In many instances, the architects of these kinds of buildings themselves said that they were not trying to kill off the family per se, or that sort of aspect of society, but to enhance social interaction between families and enrich social experience. All those shared kitchen spaces and social areas and buildings. I mean, these very modern images, they're kind of, in a way, kind of delightful, very streamlined, looks very efficient. I think as you go through images from the Soviet Union, and for most of the 20th century, you see that people are actually living rather more disgusting lives than this kind of stuff. They're kind of living in ad hoc conditions where they're forced to share spaces with other families and not necessarily enjoying it very much. A little joke from Jay Darling that probably loses its humour over the last 80-something years. A wonderful book by a German woman called Lily Korber called Life in a Soviet Factory. Korber is German, as I say. She went to Russia because she was in love with a Russian man. She wrote a book about her observations in the Soviet Union. She says in this book, tall new buildings alternate with low old ones, which however are not so old after all, because 50 years ago the wealthy citizens built their villas here in the midst of luxurious greenery. But now as we pass I read the signs: cooperative hairdresser, stadium, metalworkers club, restaurant for persons suffering from stomach diseases, 9th of January garden. I guess she's trying to bring attention to the fact that there's so many options, there's so much variety, so many opportunities that the rich have been essentially flushed out of in this case, I think she's talking about Leningrad, and the people have taken over. She says everywhere in the midst. Sorry, my cold seems to have recaught the cold that I had last time I was here 2 weeks ago. Everywhere in the midst of proletarian Leningrad, one still sees traces of old St. Petersburg. The farther one goes into the city, the finer are the buildings. The Nevsky Prospect, now known as the 25th October Prospect, that's a street, stands in comparison with the main streets of any European capital, the only difference being that one sees no parades of fashionably dressed women. Everyone is in working clothes. As regards the younger generation, it is no longer possible to distinguish the intellectuals from the manual workers. Classes are beginning to disappear in the Soviet Union. Okay. She also quotes a doctor saying, communists have no private lives. No citizens of the Soviet Union have private lives. Every individual belongs in the first place to the community, which has a right to know what sort of person he is. Every intellectual imagines himself to be the centre of the universe and a sort of little independent God. Then suddenly he finds his divinity called into question and impugned. So it's everything you believed is being got rid of, I guess, in that kind of a narrative. Okay. The Soviet Union modernises parts of, former Russia and the other states that become part of the Soviet Union in an extraordinarily speedy and impressive, in many ways, very impressive way. And it really makes a huge difference to the way that people live their lives. Naturally, through the 20s and 30s, there's this kind of massive disruption means there's also all kinds of trauma and tragedy and disaster that come to pass. It's just it's a huge maelstrom of change that runs through that area. There's a new kind of architecture for a brief time, the 20s and 30s. There's an architecture that very modern, very stark, as Jay Darling says there, although I don't know about you guys, I really disagree that this is this kind of architecture is barren of interest. I think it's actually pretty amazingly classy, but that's you know, maybe the way that everybody regards new stuff in every decade. It certainly becomes, you know, that that notion of brutalism and that notion of, you know, Soviet starkness really comes to life in this time. And we have all kinds of new and amazing designs of what might be possible in the new Soviet Union, a whole new kind of society. The Darling book, I'm just going to throw this in because I always want to put this in when I talk about this and when I use these illustrations from the J. Darling book, because there's this one thing I really hope that someone is one day going to say to me, yeah, I know exactly what that is, because I can't find any details about it anywhere else. Notionally, according to J. Darling, there's one particular, you know, if you're actually actively unemployed or you can't be bothered finding work, the state will still support you in Soviet Russia, but you have to go through the humiliation of turning up at this place, known here, it calls it the Casa, I think. So you have to turn up and get your little bit of pay, a little unemployment benefit. There's a sense that in many cases these people are alcoholics, you know, so I guess they're unwilling or unable to work on that basis. It's hard to be certain what exactly he's talking about. He says, in front of the most of the large industrial plants stands a small frame shack, conspicuous with somberness. Black steps and railing lead up to a pay window, elevated so much above the street that no victim who draws his pay there can escape notice. A mammoth black wooden crow straddles the roof beam overhead and looks down in derision, while grotesque bat-winged caricatures of the drinker, the slacker and the loafer flank the luckless employee, or not, I suppose, as he ascends and descends. So, you know, it's kind of a humiliation tactic, which I've got to say, I'll just say this one more time. I'm baffled by it, but I'm intrigued. For the main, we have in, as I said, in the USSR, we just have a massive remaking of society, a huge amount of, you know, demographic change. We have people shipped out all across the nation and sort of brought into service to create new places. There's certainly hardship, but there's a promise of great times ahead. The Russians, of course, the various people in the USSR feel that they are continually under attack, and indeed they are continually under attack. They are, you know, they present an enormous challenge to the rest of the world, and it's a very fearful time for particularly the powers that be in the USSR. At the same time, and once again, this might be hyperbole on the part of J. Darling, but there's this notion that you're constantly being, you know, broadcast to, constantly having to, you know, hear these voices in your head telling you what to do, telling you what's good for what's good for the workers, is good for the nation, is good for everything. Its ideology is constantly being broadcast to you, and at the same time, you know, and this is a common trope of communist life in the 20th century, which certainly I've heard more or less firsthand, was often the case in a lot of places in Eastern Europe and in Russia. The notion of, you know, having to queue a really long time for small household items, be it bread or something else. Darling does add that it's, for many people in the USSR, it's the best life they've ever known anyway. So they're still doing better than they were. Urbanisation is a major thing in the USSR. We have a huge change that goes on. So, you know, nice to compare that to China in the last 30 years, I would say. The kind of expansion that we've had we had in the USSR in the first few decades of the 20th century. In fact, really the second and third decades of the 20th century. So Moscow becomes a little bit of a showcase for the USSR, and Moscow's planning becomes a really important element of that. Moscow is going to be limited to 5 million people. That's close to that. I guess that's Sydney size. Ringed with a 10-mile green belt. So, you know, using that late 19th century Ebenezer Howard principle, at least that part of the principle of like reigning in the city, keeping it to a certain population. Although, you know, 5 million is about 20 times more than Howard would have liked to see. Its actual territory as under government is expanded, is doubled in size, and there's a ring road, or there's quite a few ring road layouts, as you can see, calculated to get people around as quickly as possible. A lot of building, a lot of, this is the great, notorious, wonderful thing about Moscow, the underground railways opening, starting in 1935. An architectural feat, and they're famously beautiful places in many instances, and extraordinarily grand and very exciting. There's no oppressive subway feeling, and in a way, I guess there's a sense of, you know, we've taken back the grandeur from the nobles, and now everybody can share in the grandeur in this kind of scenario. The underground rail system is not just distributing people around the city from place to place. The underground railway system also opens up, there's a whole lot of underground space there to include distributor pipes for multiple services. So gas, water, telephone, electricity, sewage pipes, heating tubes, so preheated water is sent to places. Steam, heated air for central heating, and so on. So there's the notion as well that people should live not in small communal scenarios, but in super blocks, and these super blocks are distributed around the city and around all the cities. In this case, with the extraordinary underground railway, which is a major feat. There's incidentally a strong sense, and there's a strong frequent mention in Russian literature that something like this could not be built in the old Moscow, in the pre-communist Moscow. This is this kind of thing that needed common ownership of land to be able to make it happen. The Russian planners, or the Soviet planners, create something that they call the rayon, which is very similar to the neighbourhood unit, the Western neighbourhood unit, insofar as it's a prescription for laying out segmented urban development whereby X number of people gets you a particular facility. We still have that to a degree. We have that, in a manner of speaking, we have that in Melbourne right now. X number of children in an area, you qualify for a school. That kind of thing. Well, this is much more prescriptive and much more planned and rolled out with greater sort of accuracy and I guess precision, at least in theory. So you can see the elements that sit here, and you can see how some of these elements might be shared depending on population size, and some of them will be about geographical proximity. So we have the central park here, that you get one of those when you've got three rayons together, micro rayons or rayons, and sometimes you'll have other elements that that may or may not be a part of this. We have a social centre here, once again, one social centre for 3 micro rounds, that kind of idea. These lines represent high-rise housing. Now this is all, and once again, I think we have to take this stuff absolutely with a grain of salt. A lot of the time it didn't happen. It's interesting in principle. It's an interesting idea. It was very, very influential around the world. And you have, you're probably aware there's a brief moment, and this is very brief, surprisingly, well, not surprisingly brief, it's surprising that it happened at all. But as you may be aware, at the end of the Second World War, the USSR switched sides and was helped the Allies defeat the Axis powers in 1944 and 1945. So it was okay to like the Russians and communism in the Western world for a brief time in the mid to late 1940s. And what you do find is quite a lot of intellectuals from the West. Certainly there are intellectuals from the West going to the USSR in the 1920s as well. Le Corbusier was one of them. I'm going to talk about another one in a minute. But there were people, for instance, from Melbourne who travelled to the USSR in the mid to late 1940s and came back and said, the way they do planning is, we should be doing that. We should totally be doing that. That is the best. The planners have all the control. Planners can do whatever they want. And as we all know, planning is for the greater good, for everybody. As soon as we adopt Soviet-style planning, everything will be great. That's, a lot of planners, of course, kept that way of thinking. We're going to talk about that a little bit next lecture. But they stopped, pretty soon they stopped saying, for instance, when I was in Soviet Russia and they showed me around, they sort of stopped that part of the story because it quickly becomes quite shameful to admit you have any kind of admiration for that part of the world or that kind of political system. This photograph, which is once again from the early 20th century, we see clearly a very strong contrast between an old way of life, which I think we're supposed to imagine is dying out, and I guess it was, and the new industrial complexes of the USSR, and it's very evocative from that point of view. They start building new towns in the USSR very early in the piece. They start out having very little idea of what they're doing and how to do it, and they make a lot of mess. They also, there's a whole lot of extra things that, when we see, great planned cities and great plans for cities that fall in a heap in the West, we can always name the problems and perhaps even blame the system and perhaps blame, the lack of vision and foresight and whatever. In the USSR, these things would fall in a heap, in part because of inexperience, in part because people were required to complete things super quickly. Like there was really no time to do anything. Everything had to be done very, very speedily, and a lot of corners were cut. A great example is the town of Magnitogorsk, or city of Magnitogorsk, which still survives, still exists. Doesn't really exist to the rather visionary plan of the German architect planner Ernst. I assume Ernst May. I don't know how you'd say that name, M-A-Y, in a German, the way the Germans might have said that. But this was a city that was constructed essentially at the base of a mountain made of iron. It was, once again, it was a showcase of what the Soviet muscle and power and organisation could achieve in a very short space of time that the old regime could not have achieved. So it was partly a kind of a package. It sent a message about how great Soviet organisation was and what could be done under Soviet organisation. Magnitogorsk. Magnitogorsk was originally meant to be a linear city, and it was not a linear city. The linear city was something that the Soviet planners really tried to make something out of as a concept, and you will, I suppose in a way, if you look at the things that were achieved with the Moscow Underground and the way that, transport in that particular city revolutionised that city, allowed it to grow. There's a kind of a bit of a love affair with the railway and the modernisation prospects that offered. So there was, as you can see at the top here, Le Corbusier putting forward an idea for a linear city. Tony Garnier, who was another French architect and planner, putting forward a long, thin city based around a railway line. And this is translated by the Soviet planners into this notion of the linear city. It's an old idea, but it's a fascinating one. It's one that they never really managed to get into any kind of substantial practical form, but it was certainly talked about a lot, and it had, once again, it had impact. So, for instance, in the late 1960s, early 70s, quite a few very prominent and important and actually influential, although they weren't influential in this regard, Melbourne planners and city thinkers proposed something very similar, a linear city stretching out into Gippsland from Melbourne. And this was where all the excess, so to speak, population was going to go, and new population would be attracted. And parts of, the idea here in many instances is when you live in that linear city that stretches out into the countryside like that, you're very close to the countryside. If there's pollution going on, the pollution doesn't hang around long. It doesn't get to settle on you because the wind comes through and blows it away. So you're living a cleaner life, closer to nature, and you are, as long as the trains are running, then you're pretty close to the centre of the actual Melbourne metropolis. If all other things being equal, as I say, and as you know, this did not happen, but it's a good example of how some of those Soviet ideas were being translated into ideas in the West. Okay. Very quickly, and China is a hard one for me to talk about because this is all happening now, and I'm a historian. I feel weird, even though historians are supposed to be able to write the history of right now, they're supposed to be, but I find it very hard to get my head around. When we're right in the middle of the story, I don't really know where to go with it. But you, by the way, I know there's one nation missing from that map. Does anyone know what it is? I can't remember, but there is something actually very wrong with that map. It won't be on the exam, don't worry. So China has, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's fabulous to study, urban history, is to get some sense of what's happening in China now, have some understanding of not only what's happening, but its precedents, the understanding of, what its perpetrators or its planners understand is going to happen, and where it might lead. China is, it's only been industrialising the way we understand it in the last 30 or 40 years, and as we know, I think everybody knows, that the urban expansion has been massive, extraordinary, and, I won't say unprecedented because I've already told you quite a few precedents, but perhaps unprecedented on this scale. Shanghai, 23 million people, spread over 2,450 square miles, growing by 300,000 people per year, and that's a few years ago, so who knows. We have old forms of urban living that are actually, this is pre-communism. Communism comes to China, someone might want to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 1949, 1950. Before that, we do have what you could almost call, it's not quite communal living, but we do have close, dense living built around courtyards and workyards with some very local industry going by and very close to, commercial retail premises as well in many instances. Under one of the old regimes, so this is this 20 years before communism comes to China, we do have attempts to build or rebuild grand versions of the major cities to what we would now see as kind of westernised town planning ideals. These tend not to come to fruition. What we also see is, and this is obviously 35 years ago, what we see under communism for a long time, for many decades, we have a bit of talking the talk about building new towns around the nation, but very little actually on the ground. And a lot of those plans, I had a student 4 or 5 years ago who told me he was going to get into the archives and see some of those 1950s town plans in China, and he had a go, and no one would show him anything. Possibly the stuff doesn't exist anymore. I was always saying to him, go and look at the Chinese publicity propaganda magazines of the 1950s. Surely they'll have some wonderful visions of an urbanised communist China. He wanted to go to the source, and great student, he ended up doing something really, really good with another supervisor because he couldn't get anywhere with the thing that he was talking to me about. But so we have Chinese cities really underdeveloped in the 60s and 70s when there's not much interest at government level in making an urban China. And of course, this century in particular, urban sprawl, there's a whole governmental change, and there's a whole decision to go in another direction and to particularly make China the industrial powerhouse of pretty much of the world, and urbanisation is a major part of that. And there's so many resonances with the industrial revolution of Europe in the 18th and 19th century that it's crazy. There's so much similarity. The real difference is that Britain had its industrial cities where manufacturing was going on, and that was in one tiny little piddling little nation. China is kind of like the industrial city of the world, in a manner of speaking. So we have extraordinary urban sprawl. We have amazing growth in cities. We have places that were once, 3 sheds and a chicken coop becoming one of the biggest cities in the world. And we have exceptionally remarkable high-rise housing as well in China. We also have interesting anomalies whereby, and this is another student of mine a few years ago, a master's student, did a great thesis on this topic, where he compared the notion of the Chinese nail house to holdout houses in major developments in Port Melbourne. He was comparing the planning systems in Chinese cities and in Melbourne. The comparison was almost too great, really, but we do have some really interesting examples of people who refuse to budge and refuse to allow their buildings to be demolished in the name of major urban development. They almost always lose ultimately, but they certainly make their presence felt for a time. In this case, it's Wu Ping. She had a lease and the law on her side. I gather there was a banner on the front of this building that said a citizen's legal property is not to be encroached upon, and this is, if nothing else, this is an example of the kind of amazing change that's happened in China over recent decades. Certainly under the old Russian system, and this is a different nation and a different brand of communism, very different. Under the old Russian system, you'd be very unlikely to have a leg to stand on when it came to your house being knocked down, because you probably wouldn't own a house in any case. But things were slightly, the laws shifted slightly in China since the late 19th century, late 20th century, and there were some land ownership entitlements. In the West, we find this kind of thing completely fascinating. The way that a lot of new Chinese urban development or suburban development has adopted willy-nilly hodgepodge elements of what is seen as Western architecture and Western planning, and it can be quite fascinating for us to look at. Of course, it's all part and parcel of globalisation, I guess, and if nothing else, there are a billion examples of the West appropriating ideas and aesthetics from Asian nations that, it's just a back and forth, and it feels a little bit crazy, but it also feels kind of exciting as well in many instances. A European model town known as Anting, designed in what's believed, what is talked about as a modern European style, predominantly 4 to 5 story apartments, and the idea is supposed to be that this is an image of happy families in a dynamic and tight-knit neighbourhood, which it may well be. Population of over 50,000 when and if completed. As I say, it's really difficult, I think, to talk about the current circumstances in China in any way other than occasionally with recourse to looking at what's come before in other parts of the world, and the kind of amazing angst that's generated from this rate of change. I'm sure you'll know about all the stories of people being, if not essentially forced to move, then either limited in their mobility in various ways, or actually removed from their homes in various manners to aid in this kind of massive development of China. It's something that hopefully we can come back to in future weeks. But we're going to go a little bit over to the right, and Rebecca's going to talk about Japan, which is such a great case study, apart from anything else, as well as being fascinating in itself. Yeah. You do think it's interesting, I know. Please come and share.
Yeah, I think, so as David said, obviously I'm the same. I'm so excited about my own topic that it's very easy for me to go over time, which I have done in all of the previous years that I've done this lecture. So I'll do my best.
It'll be okay.
Sorry. I know, yeah. We know how this will end.
You got 1 mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Rebecca. I've given you 7 minutes.
That's all right. Look, I was only meant to have an hour. I do try and...
Giving you an hour and 7 minutes.
I do try and make certain bits of this briefer and briefer every year, but then, of course, I add stuff in as well, so we'll see how we go. Is that? Yeah, cool. So obviously we're going to hear about Japan because that's what my area of expertise is, and so that's that. But I do think it's a really interesting contrast with what we've heard about, and particularly with the theme, which is planning outside of the West. And as David said, I mean, inevitably there is a big influence of the West in Japanese planning. But maybe it's interesting because what I'm going to deal with here is about 400 years of Japanese urbanisation. And what you're kind of going to see in that particular realm is that the early period is kind of Japanese urbanisation without much or without any Western influence, then with a lot of indirect Western influence, and then as we go into the modern age, a small period of very direct Western influence, and then some kind of mixture of that after that. So hopefully that's interesting. This, by the way, I always start off by saying this was the town that I lived in Japan for the most part. This is Shizuoka with Mount Fuji in the background. Very beautiful. I love it. So probably a bit of a summary of some of the things I'm going to talk about, and maybe in contrast with what David focused on, which I thought was really great. I'm going to be a little bit more broad at the sort of political, economic, and also regulatory end of things. And I kind of regret that there's not much human account and not much of that small-scale social account in this. But nevertheless, so probably some of the broad things that I'm going to deal with are scattered, unplanned development, but with some important local foundations that are more or less maintained. Some strong planning interventions with major gaps that were very consequential. Centralised power being subverted by just local development, and probably overall a bit of a reluctance to effectively decentralise power, which contributed to constant issues with unplanned sprawl, which is probably one of the major things that categorises Japanese planning. So, I'm going to talk about some of the key features of Japan just overall for people who are not very familiar with it, go into some of the contemporary planning system characteristics, and then we're going to launch back in time to 400 years ago. So this is Japan. Who's been there before? Cool. More and more people, I think, in recent years because the flights are so cheap. So this is a picture of urban density in Japan, and it's obviously highly populated, high population density, particularly along this area, which is the Pacific Belt. So that's Tokyo over there, Nagoya is that central red blotch there, and then Osaka. So this Pacific Belt has a very high concentration of density and industry and activity and things like that. Obviously, it's a pretty small landmass compared to the two things that we were talking about before, but very highly concentrated. And of course, one of the major things characterizing Japan at the moment is a declining and an aging population. So it's highly urbanized, but still got these lovely little rural pockets that are quite nice. Characterized, I think most people know the stereotype of very narrow buildings being very common, typically known for a very dense urban fabric. One thing that I think is really great to point out is a kind of urban development which is very common there is this thing called the Gokiso superblock. So what you've got there is neighbourhoods that have sort of small local roads that are ringed by these larger arterial roads. So you have higher and more intense development on the edges, and then kind of warmer residential development in between in a lot of cases. Obviously, it's got high-speed rail, which and it's mostly a fairly linear kind of development, so it's very effective. I always like to point out, because I'm a transport nerd, that it's got a long history of cycling. Cycling is very strong there. Without a lot of the sort of infrastructure we have here, bicycle lanes, etc., they're only sort of starting to come in now. But you see old ladies cycling, people cycling with their cats. It's a whole cross-section of society. It's very common and very safe and really fun. Japan is still, nevertheless, despite all of these active and sustainable transport modes, also very highly characterised by massive road building and some really interesting road projects. And that's where I used to live and teach kindergarten for a little while, and I really love that huge of a road that goes through the mountain there. Car parking, which is my topic, as many of you will know, some very interesting and space-efficient forms of car parking characterise Japan. And again, probably it's characterised in a lot of cases by these sort of small, warm, traditional shopping streets that also kind of reflect the residential development as well. And that's a picture that I took on my recent PhD field work of just a lovely little residential pocket with a cat in the middle. So I thought that was a great picture. So in terms of contemporary planning, there's a series of different plans that can control any particular plot of land, from area plans, land use, zoning, and then district and other plans that have, obviously varying levels of controls. So I suppose an interesting point is about a quarter of the land in Japan is actually controlled by city planning. And one of the major features of this is that areas are designated as either promoting urban development or controlling urban development. You don't need to take photos, the slides will be up afterwards. We'll kind of skip over this a little bit. So one of the other really big characteristics, I think, of a lot of Japanese cities is highly mixed-use zoning, which is one of the big contributors to the level of livability that it has. And you can see here, there's just, unlike here, there's services and shops and things are kind of all over the place, and they have a very good reach to lots of different neighbourhoods. So these are the contemporary zones, more or less. So they're quite liberal, and there's a lot of different categories. So this is what contributes to that, in a lot of cases, to that mixed-use characteristic. And land use zonings basically focus on volume, the height of buildings, and the kind of use that can be controlled. So it's very permissive, as you can sort of see there. And yeah, this is an example of building controls, basically looking at the building coverage, floor area ratios, and this has a lot of relationship to the road width, and we'll kind of go into some of the reasons for this later. One of the characteristics that you'll often see in Japanese neighbourhoods are these sloped roofs, and this is to do with the particular height controls, basically, that are trying to allow sunlight onto the street. So that's the reason people are trying to maximise their height as much as possible. Did it come up? No? Okay. So district plans can control quite a lot, and they can override uniform zone restrictions. All right, that was a little bit of an overview anyway. So now we're going to shoot back in time to the Edo period. So this is back to the 1600s, and then I'm going to go through kind of chronologically after that. So the Edo period, or the Tokugawa period, it's got two names. This was a transition from Japan, which was a feudal Japan, but it was based on warring domains all fighting with each other for control. Basically, the Edo period, it was still a feudal period, but it became urbanized, it became integrated, and it was characterized by about 300 years of stability, which is what allowed that urbanization. And after that, we get modern government. And this is one of my favorite pictures of modern government in Japan, if anybody recognizes that. So the Tokugawa period began with the Battle of Sekigahara. And this guy won it, basically. So he was the victor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, very, very important figure in Japanese history. So he became the shogun, and he basically controlled the whole country after that. So he divided the country into 250 regions that were each led by lords. And his reign was basically characterized by trying to control this nation, trying to control all of these various domains. So, as I said, they had nearly 300 years of relative stability after this, but it's very much characterized by a real centralization of power, and that power was centralized spatially in Tokyo. So the capital was shifted from Kyoto to Tokyo at this time. And the growth of a bureaucracy. There was also, my favorite historical period ever is Sankin Kotai, the Sankin Kotai system, which I'll talk about soon. But this basically was the growth of trade. There was the growth of castle towns, which sort of centralized power across the country outside of Tokyo. And as I said, Edo became the capital, it became the center of government, and it was a massive reorganization of spatial power. So, by the way, this is the reign of all of the shogunates in this guy's family. You can see they all wear the same hat. But what I think is really interesting is that the final guy was around for photography. So we actually have a picture of him, which I think is really cool. So Edo became the new capital. And as I said, it was a major center of power and activity. The Sankin Kotai system, which I mentioned, this was all based on control, trying to control all of these various lords across the country. So it required all of these lords to travel regularly on a set schedule from their domain to Edo and back year after year after year. Each of them had to leave their wives and their domains. Each of them had to leave their domains, but they had to leave, in many cases, their wives in Edo, which is another form of control. And they roughly had to spend half of their time in Edo. So they were leading two lives, basically. It was a huge expense in terms of money and time. That was the whole point of it. Nobody basically had the resources to overthrow the government. They had to maintain lives in two places, as I said, and budget very carefully. And many incurred significant debts. They were kept on a very strict schedule. And interestingly, those that were outside of the shogun's favour were placed really, really far away from Edo, because obviously that's a much, much huger burden, a much more, a larger burden. So what's really interesting about Sankin Kotai in terms of the geography of Japan is that these processions became extremely important trade routes. And of course, this necessitated all of these small little stops along the way. So local people capitalised on this to sell goods to all of these huge processions that were going back and forth. Trade boomed along these routes. They became extremely important routes. And the stops grew over time into small towns that exist today, as well as trade of regional goods being fostered. So you're getting regional exchange for the first time. And the routes solidified into the major urban belts of Japan now. So you can still see those routes reflected now in the train and the Shinkansen, the high-speed rail routes. So the other thing is that this was the time where castle towns grew. So in localities and prefectures, these became the new centres of power in those areas. It was a sort of a local centralisation of power. Peasants were drawn there because they needed jobs, and they still didn't have rights. They were peasants, but they became very, very formative for the major towns that are in Japan now. So the idea behind this was one castle for one domain, and they were able to choose sites that suited them better economically. So other towns basically tended to wither that had previously been important, and these castle towns became extremely important. So Edo, of course, experienced a big cultural boom because there was so much activity, so many people from different places coming into this one city. So it was a concentration of activity and a huge population boom. It became the centre of national administration. As I said, there were people constantly going in and out of the city and living there for long periods as well. There was a huge growth of both a permanent and a temporary population, and in 1721 the population was 1 million, so it was already enormous. And this was a huge time for the exchange of goods and ideas. So there was a huge growth of markets of new goods and resources. Street life really flourished in Tokyo. There were new kinds of jobs, new kinds of goods, and many new cultural things. I can't think of the word. Cultural things. You can see here some boating party hipsters. So one of the big characteristics of this time in Edo, in old Tokyo, is the growth of theatre and nightlife, and people just really having a good time. And a story I really like from this period is that people still had really, really controlled lives. They were on a real set schedule. This was before clocks, so a guy used to go around ringing a bell when it was time for people to go back to their work or go back inside. And people used to pay the bell ringer to walk really slowly so that they could stay out, basically. So Tokyo's spatial arrangement comes from this time. It was built around the castle. This was a feudal period, and very class-based. So you can see here the castle in the centre of Tokyo there, rings coming out around that, and this is modern Tokyo. So it still reflects that spatial arrangement. Very rigid class structures. It was a feudal time. Merchants were down the bottom because of the view that they didn't produce anything of their own. But of course, during this period of trade, they became very wealthy. So this was a bit of a switch for them. Class was very spatialised, and the system was very rigid and hereditary. You were stuck with that. And during this period, class became really split by land ownership. So this is a typical Japanese block at that time. The inner sort of circle there, that's the back streets. This is not very good housing. So these were the renters, and the people on the outside who opened up to the street, these were the landowners. I was talking to my class last week about Yamanote. So Yamanote, if many of you know the Yamanote line in that first picture there, this is the major sort of circular train line in Tokyo these days. That name refers to the high city. So these were the people, typically samurai quarters, and they lived on the high plateaus. And the Shitamachi, the low city, this was for commoners, they were obviously living on floodplains that were not very good to live on. So that structure is, again, really reflected in the spatial structure of the city. These were the samurai and the daimyo residences, the Yamanote, and the train line sort of links these major circles around there. And these were the commoner areas. So they were distant from the castle, and they flooded a lot. The commoner areas as well could be around 4 times denser than the samurai districts as well. So you can see that there. For many people who don't know, Japan has a block-based sort of address system. So the addresses start from like the largest and go down and down and down into the block. So it's, often you start with the number of your block, your neighbourhood, your district, etc., etc. We'll skip that. So spatial control and spatial governance at this time was often centred around incremental negotiation. Obviously, the central government was very powerful, but they didn't have building codes or fine-grained controls, so it was very incremental and just done ad hoc. And also, Tokyo is very, very, and Edo has always been very, very characterised by disaster and fire. So the city has been wiped out many, 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 many times. And this, in a way, was seen as a form of control, but also not a very successful form of control. So, for example, after the major fire in the last slide, this was a fire break that was instituted, but it was still, over time, incrementally occupied by stalls and warehouses and merchants, and at the end of the century, it had no effect. It was all just redeveloped again. So as I said, disaster was seen as an opportunity for reorganisation. You can see down there in 1979 still, sorry, that shouldn't be 1979, 1879 I'm pretty sure, 97% wooden buildings and 57% were yakiya, which is literally burnable houses. So obviously they burned a lot. I'll skip that. And interestingly, there was a sort of there was a very unique kind of form of urban governance that was sort of based on shared responsibility. It's not as rosy as that sounds, but different classes had entirely separate forms of legal and administrative systems, and they were administered separately. So it was kind of elaborate, but it was actually extremely effective, and it required minimum government investment. So the Tokugawa era sort of overall is characterised by being creating one of the most urbanised countries in the world at that time. It had relatively high levels of well-being, relatively good housing, again, compared to what they had before. It fostered highly integrated supply networks. The economy became monetarised during this time. Many sophisticated finance systems were developed, and they had a very rich material culture, but still characterised by a lack of control in a lot of ways. And also, people's lives were still very, very heavily controlled by the government at this stage. There was a lot of obligation and responsibility, and it was seen that there was a general disdain for the common people. So it's, not all rosy. So the Tokugawa reign ended when the shogunate was killed by some samurai, basically. That's not a photo of them doing that. That's set up. So the Tokugawa reign turned into the Meiji period, which I'll go over sort of slightly briefly. But the more or less, like the Meiji period is characterized by a very top-down revolution. This was just one government swapping out with another government. It's characterized by modernization, westernization, which was driven by a fear of being taken over at that stage. It was a strategic thing. Industrialization, involvement with the global economy for the first time, but also politically restoring the old imperial rule. And it was a huge political and social restructuring, and there was a very, very strong growth of the military at this time. So in terms of cities, there were strong pressures to modernize, and I suppose two of the characteristics at this time were that peasants were highly taxed and samurai were very, very highly indebted and weakened as a class. So there was a lot of reform that was needed, and there was a sense that there was a need for urban planning reform. So just to skim over this really briefly, as David said, there was a sense that it was really necessary to take a look at what was going on in the West in terms of urban planning. I suppose that there was a fear that this was a real necessity at this time, because Japan felt that if they weren't doing this, then they were going to lose out as a nation. They were going to be overtaken, etc. So it wasn't just that the ideas were compelling; it was also sort of driven by a fear. But nevertheless, many people went overseas at this time, looked at other cities. There were a lot of missions to the West, essentially, to bring back expertise, and this was done. So this is one of them. This is a group of people that went over to Europe and a bunch of cities, and they were very impressed with Paris and Haussmann in particular, and they brought back a lot of that knowledge. So also during this time, there was a lot of political and social restructuring, as you can imagine. They abolished the class system. People had guaranteed freedom of residence, occupation and religion, and the feudal structures were replaced with a modern, highly centralized national administration. Of course, this was still centralized in Tokyo. So it had a whole bunch of new institutions, as you can see here: railways, newspapers, law courts, the postal system, all of those sorts of tenets of modernization. And I really love this picture here. This is one of my favorite old woodblock prints. This was, what is it called? The New Fighting the Old. So this is really characterizing how much change was happening here at this time and how much controversy was as a result. So there was a boon for democracy at this time. There were citizens' rights movements, and a new constitution came into effect, system of parliament, etc., etc. And also this is reflected in local government reform. Local government wasn't given much control or resources, but it was seen as being an imposition of duties and responsibilities. So they were responsible for collecting taxes, building roads, etc. But it was still really the central government trying to just shift responsibilities. So they had responsibility without authority, basically, and it was really just delegated national planning. It wasn't localities making choices for themselves. There was an amalgamation of prefectures down to what we have today, 46. The Home Ministry was a very, very, very powerful force at that time. They basically, they were a sector within the central government that was given an enormous amount of power over what was effectively urban planning. That was too much controversy as well. There was a huge amount of land reform as well at that stage, because it had been a highly agricultural nation. So there was a complete resurvey of all of the agricultural lands in the whole nation. Land at that time became a commodity, many small-scale urban farmers, in a way, they were given ownership of their land, but at the same time, it was poorly done and many fell into debt. whereas the larger landlords actually gained a huge amount of power during that time, and there was an institutionalisation of the landlord class. Rail came in at this time. This was a huge priority for the Meiji government because they saw this as a very important part of modernisation. And it was privatised and then nationalised and then privatised in some other ways, and this has been a constant back and forth in Japanese rail governance, basically. But they did build a lot of rail. So in terms of early modern urban planning, there was a focus on improving urban conditions, mostly in terms of fixing the problems of all of those dense buildings, trying to convert wooden structures and widening the roads. And of course, this is very much oriented around fire. Its first city planning law was in 1888, the TCIO, the Tokyo City Improvement Ordinance. I'll leave a lot of information up here for you to read themselves, for you to read yourselves if you're interested. But effectively, it had some wider ambitions, but in reality, it really only resulted in road widening and waterworks, which was important, but it didn't do much outside of that. So the castle towns, again, is a reflection of like that wider planning that's happening around the city, around the nation rather. They were now focusing on laying out new access roads to rail stations and imposing a new grid pattern around the city, around the train stations. So there was a lot of purposeful urban planning that was happening in the very central areas, but there was an awful lot of unregulated growth that was happening at the periphery. This was not planned. This is an example of Shizuoka City. You can see the train station here, very close to the castle. So the overall characteristics of the Meiji era are the dominance of central government, the reliance on direct government involvement in building projects. The central government is still controlling everything, rather than the reliance on a regulatory system. There was a consistent lack of funds for urban infrastructure, rapid development of technical sophistication in plan making, in terms of the knowledge and the expertise, a familiarity with Western practices, but still that strong central government control over planning and very effectively very weak controls over actual development. So going into 1912 to 1926, this is the very, very short Taisho period. The Meiji Emperor died and his son came in. So this is where the pace of change is picking up, leading up to World War II, industrialisation, urbanisation, and as a result, environmental degradation is occurring. Because of all of this, there was a need to improve planning measures. This was really strongly felt. And also governments felt the need to catch up to Western military and industrial power. So planning was focused on, again, trying to control this urban expansion that was happening on the fringe, this sprawl. It was still characterised by very, very highly central government that prioritised that economic growth, railroads, all of these sort of big infrastructure and big economic priorities. But there was relatively weak development of the middle classes and civil society still. Like regular people didn't have a lot of input into these things, into public life, into planning. And planning still didn't have a very broad base of support. There wasn't much planning activism at this stage. So because of all of the poor conditions that came as a result of this rapid development with poor planning, in response to that, there was beginning to be the development of a civil society because of things like workers' rights, women coming into the workforce, and poor living conditions. So you saw the development of unions, new kinds of political parties, socialism, Marxism, anarchism, etc. There were more voices in politics starting to come in. And more people were starting to advocate into the urban planning arena. Neighbourhood associations were one of the things that came out of this. The government was trying to respond to this controversy that was happening by designating local neighbourhood units that basically had governance over some small neighbourhood matters. And they were very effective in a lot of ways, but it was a little bit placating. So in 1919, we have the first attempt at a comprehensive planning system, which is applied to the whole urban area as opposed to just the central areas. And Goto Shinpei here was a very big force in that. He was a doctor and a social bureaucrat and very interested in planning. So he established a city planning section within the Home Ministry, and this was really making planning, this was intended to make planning a real function of government, whereas the central government hadn't really wanted to do this before. So it was ambitious, but basically it were only a weak form of his ambitious plans were passed in the end, which is a running theme. It was seen by the central government as not important. So it had a focus on developing major infrastructure, which is what the central government wanted. And basically it brought in a land use system, urban buildings law, a building line system, which is difficult to explain, a system for designating public facilities, and a land readjustment system, which is a thing that exists in several other countries. So land readjustment, in a nutshell, is a way of buying back land from people who live in sort of what is seen as haphazard development, where it's not sort of a nice neat grid system, and giving them back a portion of their land so that you can, through that process, straighten the roads and rationalise plots, I suppose. So Tokyo zoning plan, like we've seen over and over again in many other cities, at this stage, green belts and whatnot were the trend as an idea of trying to control this sprawl that was happening. So they were trying to rationalise planning with this comprehensive zoning. It failed to enable the hoped-for change, basically. It was poorly adopted. There was a lot of political pushback. Of course, the actual intended laws were weakened through the political process. And you can see there by 1930, only 27 of the 97 intended cities had adopted the zoning system. There were all kinds of issues, and it was obviously bringing something like this in was required a lot of complex administration, so difficult to just make happen. 1923, there was a huge earthquake and another huge fire. So somebody there is quoted as saying, "Edo finally disappears." 44% of urban Tokyo was destroyed by the fire. There's some pictures. I like disaster pictures. So this was actually a more effective kind of planning. This was the reconstruction plan that happened as a result after the Great Kanto earthquake. So it was ambitious. They brought in a lot of Western planning techniques as well, because of all of the reasons that I mentioned before. These were seen as techniques that could help to prevent this kind of widespread devastation after fires. And very strong controls were brought in because of the nature of the context, that basically enabled the Reconstruction Board to carry out land readjustment without the consent of owners. So that's why it had more success. So this here you can see is the Great Kanto Earthquake Reconstruction Plan. The main things that came out of this really are, this is where a lot of the huge trunk roads and the road network was laid down. But as a result of this, because there was so much activity, it did result in urban planners being trained en masse. There was just so much work to do. And it boosted the prestige of planning, because I guess it was getting things done in a way and people were learning a lot more about it. So you can see here, this is the result of a land readjustment process here. These black lines are new roads being put in. So going back to the castle cities, what we can see here is the arterial roads and the highways are coming into all of these cities. And we're seeing a lot more early suburban growth at this stage. So there's still no effective control over suburban growth, just putting in roads. And the roads are actually creating more suburban growth because now people are living further out. So you can see here during this time as well, this is Tokyo's population density changing during the period. sprawling. This is the sprawling Tokyo that we know today. Obviously, when I say sprawl in a Japanese context, it's a different kind of sprawl to what we have here, but it's still spreading unplanned development for the most part. So, will this work? Yay. So what I wanted to put up...
With every cup freshly ground, it's love at first sip. Good call.
Let's turn that down a little bit. So I just wanted to put up here like a little bit of a video, partly so you get a little bit of a break from me speaking.
Is it?
Yeah, it's ready. I just turned the sound down.
I know, but is it going to come up?
Oh. I don't know why.
So I come here and stand and watch.
Does that?
No.
Well, maybe I can't play a video.
I think you probably can.
Okay. You sound confident.
Oh, yeah. Just put it straight into internet. Rather than trying to get a link.
What do you mean? Oh, you mean copy...
Yeah, I reckon try that. That's once how I got around it.
But it is in the browser.
I know, but I can't see it's not going to the...
No, you're right, because it's... No, I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
I can't see it.
I see what she means now, because it's stuck.
I might be wrong.
I was so hoping this would be smooth.
Nothing's ever smooth. But if we get out of this...
Yep. Yes, I think you're right. Okay.
And here we go.
All right, so now it should work.
Is that looking good?
Yes. Beautiful. All right. So this is a really unique video. This is film of this sort of only just starting to come in. This is a colorized film. It's been done fairly recently of 1917 Japan, just so you can get a bit of a feel for what the cities were like at this time. I don't think we need so much music. So for those who don't know, Tokyo had a massive streetcar system. You can see here this dichotomy between Western fashion and Japanese fashion. Don't know why there's so many boats. I don't like how nostalgic this music makes me feel I'm meant to feel. So that guy has a Western hat and a Japanese robe. It's amazing. This is really dramatic. I listened to this with the music off before. This is before safety standards. Learning English. Cursive, which must be unbelievably difficult. This guy's just being a stereotype. Early vending machines. Isn't that amazing? No. Don't get that coffee, it's not good.
Are you okay to get back in or shall I?
Do I just press that? Yep.
And then you're...
Can we just do this?
You know what you're doing.
Yeah, good. I prefer that. Thanks. Okay, so now we're going to zoom into actually my favourite period. I think actually all of Japan at the moment is really nostalgic for the Showa period. When you go to shops over there, they like bookshops and gift shops, they have all of this nostalgia for the Showa period. So this is from 1926 to 1989, which is quite a large chunk of time. But it's people's parents' age, I guess. People as in me, my age. So we're passing by the war. After the war, basically, there was a huge evacuation from Tokyo and the major cities, but then they sprung back massively, and the population just grew and grew and grew from there. This is when you'll often hear the phrase Japan's economic miracle. This was the period of the economic miracle. There was rapid economic growth after the war. This is when Japan became an economic superpower and the world's second largest economy, so it was just a huge booming time. And again, there was another huge spate of concentration of population and industry in the main urban areas, and particularly this is where that Tokaido Pacific Belt megalopolis grew up. And there were major reforms to land and local government as a result. So up until 1952, I think, the US occupation, occupied Japan, and they redistributed 1/3 of the total farmland from landowners, from landlords to owner cultivators. So no longer tenant farmers. I've written this very odd. So basically, land ownership made families less likely to move away from the city, in a sense, but it was also directly responsible for a lot of scattered land holdings, which again is going to make planning control much more difficult. So they didn't consolidate as a part of this process. In terms of local government reforms, we're starting to see the decentralisation of actual power, not just responsibilities at this stage. So the occupation passed the local autonomy law in 1947, which was, part of their plan to develop democracy and to stop, the central government from having as much power. There were direct elections for prefectural governments for the first time, rather than simply being appointed by the Home Ministry. And there was an expansion of prefectural and local government powers. So during this whole post-war rebuilding phase, they took this opportunity again, disaster, the city was razed. They took this opportunity to modernise urban areas again, or attempt to modernise urban areas again. And again, this involved the ideas of green belts, grand avenues, road building, fire breaks, several new acts were brought in. The 1919 system had still lacked power, so this was an attempt to try and give urban planning more power. These plans, as most plans, failed again, or at least mostly failed, and those grand ambitions weren't realised. So in a way it was overly ambitious, and it was the least realised plan of all of the major plans for Tokyo. So this is a picture of what they had intended. And a big part of this plan was that it was aimed at population growth. People saw the mass migration to Tokyo as a real problem. They were trying to control that force as opposed to, I suppose, planning more effectively for the larger population. It was a huge cost, and of course this was post-war. Funds were needed all over the country, so they just couldn't afford to pour those funds into Tokyo. It was not implemented for the most part. And after this, the vast majority of Tokyo was still built ad hoc under the previous legislation, under the 1919 laws. You could not stop this massive migration. This is just a picture of what the intended LR projects were and what the actual projects were. Nagoya, though, if you've been there, that was an exception. They actually achieved a lot of their LR projects, their land readjustment projects. So the entire central city was reconstructed into a grid of broad avenues. Has anyone been to Nagoya? No? Okay. It's not a very popular city in Japan. It's because of this, really. It's a very car-oriented city. So during this period of rapid growth, basically economic growth, of course, was a top government priority. This created an environmental crisis, as is so often the case. There were high rates of industrial expansion along the belt. Industry was being prioritised. And as a result of the environmental crisis, which I can't underline enough was a true environmental crisis, this incentivised a huge citizen mobilisation for government to prioritise health and local concerns. I have to bring this in because this is my area of interest. So in response to the mass motorisation that was happening in the 1950s, and Japan mass motorised later than Western cities did, there was a lot of congestion on the streets. There was a lot of controversy over who owned the streets and what the streets were for. So they brought in a parking law in 1958. And this effectively resulted in removing on-street parking from the streets, and it created an off-street public parking garage market that has been very effective. The Olympics as well, I'll just brush over this, but it was a huge deal in 1964 for Tokyo. So this was seen as leverage to build huge infrastructure projects, and one of those, of course, is the high-speed rail system, and monorail and subway systems, etc., etc. So a lot of those streetcars that you saw, they were all ripped up. They were becoming ineffective because there was so much congestion in Tokyo competing with cars, and this was the incentive to build the subway system, the metro system. In terms of the regular castle town form of planning, urban development was basically becoming more complex. They still hadn't solved their control problems, so there was more and more haphazard, unserviced development on the fringe. They were still focusing on widening and straightening the main roads. And as I said, many streetcar systems were torn out at this stage and replaced with buses, or in Tokyo's case, the subway system. So you can see here, this is the growth of the streetcar system up to about the 60s, and then its demise into the 70s. But there's still at least one line. So in 1968, this was when the new city planning law came in. This was a very big deal. So there were 5 major changes here that I won't go into, but more or less, this was a real delegation of planning responsibility to the prefectural and local governments. And importantly in this case, it was allowing a lot more public participation to come into planning. It was fairly tokenistic at this stage, but it was a start. And a lot of this, of course, is in response to the environmental crisis. There was a more sophisticated zoning system, so instead of just 4 zones, they expanded out to 8. Though there was a delegation of responsibility, again, there was still limited policy influence for local government. The central government still retained financial control. 70% of the revenue was from the central government. And local governments basically still lacked legal powers on top of the finance to do what they wanted to do. I'll skip over this, but Sembeki zoning basically that came in at this stage, this is where areas are designated as urban control areas or urban promotion areas. It resulted in some staged development, a little bit less unplanned sprawl. So it was a much more effective law. These legal changes allowed local governments to require development, to require infrastructure facilities of development, sewers and roads, etc. And they had some legal authority to refuse development permission for the first time. So they were starting to gain some control. But there were some really weird loopholes in this system, basically. So the control was focused on buildings, but it ignored things like car parks and scrap metal yards and other kinds of facilities, which again, resulted in really odd pockets of odd gaps in control. Small developments as well were exempted, and government and public developments were exempted. So there's lots and lots and lots of gaps. The zoning system was expanded, as I said, and it was fairly permissive. In 1975, this is when the first round of zoning is completed nationally. Everywhere has got zoning now. The zones were unusually small, and this was one of the things that contributed to some of the arguably excellent outcomes that you see in neighbourhoods today. A lot of walkability, a lot of liveliness, and a lot of chances for commercial activities and small shops, etc., that allow people to walk to services and shops nearby. But this did also come with price inflation, which spread from commercial areas to residential areas. Prices are going up. And it also, crucially, allowed a lot of residential and industrial uses to come together. So there was an expansion of tools, but there's still clear limitations to the system, and the new system still failed to prevent sprawl. This is for a whole number of reasons that I won't read out here, but if you're interested, you can read about these odd little things here. But this is an example of some of the scattered patterns of build-up in a town called Omia. So this is the developed land in 1968, and this is the developed land in 1991. It's just happening all over the place, filling in. So as I said, there was an environmental crisis in the 1960s. It was very, very, very serious, and a lot of people died, and a lot of people got sick, and you know, the legacies of this remain today. But as I said, as a result of this, there was a huge pushback from the community that was very successful, at least in the short term. So there was a very successful civil mobilisation, and there was a focus, for the first time, a very, very big focus on demanding local quality. And a lot of this was driven by housewives. People were responding to, in part, to the longer commutes and the decrease in community ties that had happened as a result of suburbanisation. And there is a famous court case in 1972 called the Big Four, because there were four big companies that they were particularly fighting against. So as a result of this court case, there were a lot of legal successes that brought in the separation of more toxic industry and residential areas and height limits. The idea of sunshine was still very important. Tokyo was still sprawling and decentralising. And there was a central government effort to renew the CBD areas, and as a result, this is that period where land prices were absolutely soaring. So as a result of a lot of this renewal, basically, this depopulated the central core of Tokyo significantly, creating even more sprawl. This is where a lot of bedroom suburbs are popping up, and a lot of malls and that sort of car-centric development. In 1974, the National Land Agency came in basically in response in order to try and promote rational land supply. So again, this is national control, and there was a real hierarchy of various laws, plans and controls. This received praise from planners all around the world, but it did, of course, have implementation problems. So there was incomplete coverage, again, and there was also overlap between different areas that competed with each other, bureaucratic competition, so it was poorly integrated, basically. As a result of this, though, municipalities independently developed municipal development plans to try and do something about it. But of course, as a result of that, they were uncoordinated with the national systems. So there's just all kinds of integration problems. So then we get into the modern period. I've got a few minutes. Yep, great. So in 1980, this is where that thing I talked about right at the beginning, which is a big part of contemporary planning systems in Japan now, district planning came in. And again, this is an attempt to deal with sprawl after the failure of the 1968 plan. So this brought in district improvement plans, which had specific regulations for areas, and statements of policy intent. It's weird to think about that coming in at some point, but that's where it came in. So there's a lot of master plans as a result of this, visions, objectives, a lot of this stuff that we sort of recognise in modern planning systems. And there are new controls over things like road layouts, lot sizes, building design. So this is starting to be that system that I described at the beginning. There's a stronger municipal government, and this allows strengthening in certain areas of urban planning. So it's starting to be more effective. I'll skip over that. There is still, you can still see the development like we have here of kind kind of estate planning, but it's not such a huge feature of Japan. So then we hit, I think, probably what a lot of people are familiar with in the 1980s, the bubble economy. Asset prices fell drastically and Japan entered what people call its lost decade. I don't really agree with that, but that's how a lot of economists designate it. And it's arguably continuing today. So there's a legacy of big, expensive buildings, particularly in CBD areas from the boom period, increasing vacant lots as developers went bankrupt. The continued development of elevated expressways and subways, land prices went down, which is a good thing for me when I lived there. I had a very low rent. There was a retail shift from the big department stores near highways and stations, going back to that smaller convenience store, there's a renewal around interests in those local shopping streets, etc. But of course it's struggling with the legacy of the car-centric development. And there's still a continuation now of the dual urban planning structure, planned and unplanned. But more citizen participation is coming in, I suppose, bit by bit, and this is now referred to as machi-zukuri, which literally means town making. So machi-zukuri has become a very, very big thing for citizens to take part in and to demand more powers in. Yeah, we'll leave that. Yeah, so, where am I going? 2 minutes. Okay, so that's more or less 400 years of Japanese urban planning. It's a lot to take in, but if you are interested, as I said, there's a lot more information on these slides that might help you. But also what I've done here is list a bunch of books that you might be interested in reading. A lot of this came from that first book there. But the one on the end, Learning from the Japanese City, is a really, really fun read. This was written by Barry Shelton. I don't know if anybody's heard of Barry Shelton. He used to be at this university and he was a very, very well-regarded urban designer and a lovely man. There's a fun video of Japanese history here, but I don't think I'll play it for time's sake. So, yeah, are there any questions? Keeping in mind that's about the extent of my knowledge.
It's not true, Rebecca.
No, that's it. That's literally it. Yeah?
The original parking laws, they came in when? In 19...
Towards the end of the 50s, 1958,
yeah,
I think.
What were the driving factors to establish the parking laws?
It was only during that period, really, that that most people were more and more people were starting to get cars. So the streets were starting to fill up with cars at that stage. Before that, even at the early 50s, it was still, a few elites and mostly Americans who were driving cars. Most Japanese people were the chauffeurs. But during that period, that's where more and more people, it was a huge status symbol, of course. More people were buying cars, they were gaining wealth. So that was where this period is where that big question between who owns the streets, what's the power play between pedestrians and cars, this was all coming into play. And of course, because in a lot of cases they are narrow streets, having cars parked there was very contentious. And
how did that play out? Because the streets looked like they were, because it would have been, they had to be quite walkable because they were narrow and all that. So how did that play out, the politics of who owned the streets, the power and the elites?
Yeah, I'm only just kind of getting into this sort of stuff myself because it's fascinating. I'm more and more interested in what the politics were around it, because obviously this was a central government push. They were responding to the controversy, but of course they had their own, this was aligning with their own interests in terms of development. So they had I don't know the full extent of it, but they had their own interests in not wanting to have this problem on the streets. They're thinking about their desire for city streets and what they want to see. I would say it was as much about keeping the streets free for cars to move than it was, exactly, yeah. But possibly there was more to it than that. Any other questions? No? Okay.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
That's okay.
Wonderful as learned so much.
It's a lot, but it's because it's a subject I'm really interested in.
And we do put the slides up on.
Yeah. You don't need to take photos of all of that. They're going up.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Catherine. Do we have any housekeeping before? But it is actually teaching break next week, isn't it? Yeah, I thought so. Great. All right. So, and we'll have the questions for the next tutorial paper up in the next few days as well. So, something to look forward to spoil your Easter break. So, thanks a lot. We'll see you in, I guess, 2 weeks.